The badge hit the floor before Petra Solis even realized she'd dropped it. Not thrown. Dropped. There was a difference, and in the 3 seconds it took her to decide whether to pick it up, she understood that the difference mattered to her more than she'd expected. Director Heyman was still talking. Something about conduct unbecoming. Something about the integrity of the supply chain audit process. Something about how the decision had not been made lightly. Petra had stopped listening somewhere around the word unfortunately. She'd heard that word before. From her mother's oncologist, from her ex-husband's lawyer, from the adjunct coordinator who'd told her the nursing scholarship had been redistributed. Unfortunately was a word people used when they'd already made up their minds and needed you to believe they felt bad about it. She picked up the badge, set it on his desk. That felt more like her. You'll have 30 minutes to collect your personal belongings, Hamann said. Kepler will escort you. Kepler was 23 years old and had the decency to look at the floor when he said her name in the hallway. She didn't blame him. She'd trained Kepler. She'd written the protocol he used every morning to log controlled substance intake at Morrow Veterans Medical Center, and now he was walking 6 feet behind her, carrying a cardboard box while she cleaned out the drawer she'd kept stocked with granola bars and 2 spare pens and a photograph of her sister's kids from 3 Christmases ago. She took the photograph, left the granola bars. Someone would eat them. The parking lot was bright in a way that felt aggressive. March in San Antonio did that sometimes. The light came flat and sharp off the concrete and made everything look slightly more real than it needed to be. Petra sat in her car for 4 minutes without starting it. She was good at counting. Dosage calculations, inventory cycles, discrepancy rates. Numbers were her language, and she'd used them to build a case that nobody at Morrow had wanted to hear. 14 months of inventory logs. 47 documented discrepancies. A pattern in the controlled substance requisition records that pointed cleanly, unmistakably, to Kellerton Pharmaceutical Supply, the contracted distributor that had been servicing Morrow and 6 other VA facilities for the past 3 years. Substituted compounds, diluted formulations, drugs that looked right in the paperwork and wrong in the patients. She had the records. She'd printed copies. They were in a manila folder in her tote bag because she had known the way you know a storm is coming before the clouds appear, that the day she submitted the formal complaint would also be the last day she worked at Morrow Veterans Medical Center. She started the car. She drove 14 minutes to her apartment, made coffee she didn't drink, and sat at her kitchen table looking at the folder. The coffee went cold. The afternoon went pale. She thought about calling her sister in Tucson and decided against it. She thought about calling the VA Inspector General's hotline and decided she needed to eat something first. She made toast, ate half of it standing over the sink. Her phone rang at 6:47 p.m. Unknown number. San Antonio area code, but not one she recognized. She almost didn't answer. She answered, "Is this Petra Solis?" The voice was male, measured with the particular flatness of someone trained to sound calm in environments that were not. Depends on who's asking. "My name is Sergeant Major Decker. I'm with a unit currently operating out of Fort Sam, Houston. I understand you filed a controlled substance discrepancy report with Morrow's compliance office approximately 6 weeks ago." Petra sat down slowly. That report was sealed pending internal review. "Yes, ma'am. So how do you have it?" There was a pause, not the pause of someone thinking, the pause of someone deciding how much to say. "Mrs. Solis, we have a situation. I'd rather not discuss it over the phone. Is there any chance you're available to come in tonight?" She looked at the folder on her table. She looked at her half-eaten toast. She thought about 14 months of inventory logs and 47 discrepancies and a job she no longer had. "Give me 20 minutes, she said. Fort Sam Houston at night had a particular quality, organized, lit, purposeful in a way that civilian spaces rarely were. Sergeant Major Decker met her at the gate himself, which she later understood was unusual. He was somewhere in his mid-40s, with the kind of stillness that comes from spending years in rooms where panic is not permitted. He shook her hand and said thank you for coming, like he meant it. He took her to a building she would later learn was used by a medical readiness unit, and into a conference room where 3 other people were already waiting. 2 men in uniform. One she recognized as a doctor from the insignia, one she didn't, and a woman in civilian clothes who introduced herself only as Weston and had the particular energy of someone from an oversight office who'd learned to introduce herself only as Weston. "Before we begin," Decker said, "I want to be direct with you about why you're here." Petra put her folder on the table. "I was fired today for filing a report that said Kellerton Pharmaceutical Supply has been delivering substituted and diluted medications to VA facilities across the Southwest region. If that's what this meeting is about, I've had a long day and I'd prefer we skip to the part where I explain what I found." There was a silence in the room that had a texture to it. The doctor, whose name was Dr. Corwin, which she'd seen on his nameplate, leaned forward slightly. Mrs. Solis, we have 11 soldiers currently presenting with symptoms that are inconsistent with their prescribed treatment outcomes. They've been receiving their medications through the standard VA contracted supply chain. Petra felt something go very still inside her. What medications? 3 are on anti-infective protocol. 4 are on post-surgical pain management regimens. 4 are on psychiatric medication programs. 2 of those are flagged critical. How long have they been symptomatic? The earliest we can trace is 6 weeks ago. The pattern accelerated in the last 6 weeks. The same 6 weeks since she'd filed the complaint. The same 6 weeks Morrow's compliance office had been reviewing her report while doing nothing. She opened the folder. They kept her for 4 hours that first night. She went through every page of her documentation with Dr. Corwin and a pharmacologist named Hensley who'd been brought in by phone and was currently on speaker from Bethesda, asking questions in the rapid-fire shorthand of someone used to working fast. Weston took notes and said very little and watched Petra in a way that felt like assessment rather than judgment. At 11:15 p.m., Decker walked her back to her car. "You drove here with originals," he said, nodding at her folder. "I have copies at home, digital backups, 3 locations." He almost smiled. She stopped at her car. The lot was quiet. Above them, the sky was the deep blue-black of a city that never fully darkens. "Who shut down my report?" He was quiet for a moment. "That's what we're trying to find out." Someone at Morrow made a call. Someone decided that a 14-month audit showing systematic substitution across 47 inventory cycles was less important than keeping Kellerton's contract intact. "That's not an accident. That's a decision." "Yes," he said. "It is. Are your soldiers going to be okay?" He looked at her steadily. "We have better information tonight than we had this morning. That helps." She drove home. She didn't sleep. The next 8 days were the strangest of her life. Stranger even than the year her mother was sick. Stranger than the divorce. Stranger than the afternoon. She'd first noticed the discrepancy numbers and sat alone in the pharmacy stockroom, trying to convince herself she was wrong. Decker's unit moved fast. Weston, it turned out, was from the Defense Criminal Investigative Service, and she had been building a parallel case for 2 months, triggered by an anomaly in a procurement audit at a different facility entirely. In Albuquerque, she'd had data. What she hadn't had was the pharmacy-level documentation that showed exactly how the substitution was happening, at what point in the supply chain, and which batch numbers corresponded to which facilities. Petra had that. Petra had all of that. She worked from Fort Sam Houston on a visitor's badge, in a room with Dr. Corwin and Hensley on speaker, and a young specialist named Goff who processed data faster than anyone she'd ever watched. She cross-referenced her inventory records against Weston's procurement data. She built a timeline. She identified the pattern. Kellerton's substituted shipments traveled through a secondary fulfillment center in Laredo that had been added to the distribution network 18 months ago, quietly, with a contract amendment that had been approved without the standard review process. The contract amendment had been authorized by a deputy director in the VA's Office of Acquisition and Logistics named Brent Holloway. His signature was on 11 documents. His approval code was in 4 procurement system entries. He had been with the VA for 9 years and had a regional performance award on his wall from 2023. "His name keeps appearing," Petra said, laying the documents side by side on the conference table at 10 p.m. on the 6th day. Goff was still at his station. Weston had come back from wherever she went at night and was standing in the doorway with coffee. "We see it," Weston said. "This isn't carelessness. The Laredo routing adds 3 days to the distribution timeline and increases the per-unit cost by 11%. Nobody adds a fulfillment step that slows delivery and raises cost unless the purpose of that step is something other than fulfillment. The purpose of that step," Weston said, "was to allow for substitution at a point in the chain that fell outside the standard inspection window." Petra looked at her. "How long have you known?" "We've suspected for 6 weeks." "Suspected isn't the same as knowing. And now?" Weston looked at the documents on the table. "Now it's different. The 11 soldiers got better. Not all at once, it was a process, and 2 of the psychiatric cases required careful transition management that Dr. Corwin handled with a precision that Petra found quietly reassuring to watch. But the medications were pulled, the correct formulations were sourced through an emergency procurement bypass, and by day 4 the trajectory had shifted enough that Decker stopped using the word critical. On the morning of the 7th day, Petra was in the break room making her 3rd coffee of the day when she heard boots in the hallway that sounded different from the usual rhythm of the building. Deliberate. Multiple. Coming toward this wing, she turned around with her mug and found herself facing 4 men in combat uniforms, trail dirty and clearly just returned from somewhere that wasn't here. The one in front was tall, somewhere in his late 30s, with the particular composure of someone who'd learned to assess a room in about a second and a half. He looked at her directly, not past her, not around her, at her. "Mrs. Solis?" he said. Yes. He extended his hand. Chief Warrant Officer Bannon. My team was in the field when this started. We've been briefed. He glanced at the conference room door. I understand we have you to thank for the documentation. She didn't know what to say to that. She was holding a coffee mug in a government break room wearing the same cardigan she'd had on when she got fired a week ago, and a man who'd clearly just gotten off a transport from somewhere significantly more dangerous than San Antonio was thanking her. I filed a report, she said. Nobody acted on it. We're acting on it now, Bannon said. The other three men had the same attentiveness, present, direct, none of the performative casualness or the hierarchical shuffling she'd spent 12 years navigating in hospital environments. One of them, she noticed, had a bandage on his left forearm. She almost asked about it. Decided it wasn't her place. How are your men, she said instead. Bannon's expression shifted just slightly. Getting there. Better than they were. He looked at her steadily. You've been here every day. The work wasn't finished, he said. It wasn't. But you could have left it to us. She thought about Hampman's office and the badge on the floor and 14 months of documentation that someone had decided didn't matter. I could have, she said, but I'd spent long enough watching people treat veterans like an administrative problem. I wasn't going to do that. Bannon was quiet for a moment. Around them, the building went about its morning business. Footsteps, radio, the distant sound of someone on a call. Then he said, Thank you, Miss Solis. I mean that. Weston made her arrests on a Thursday. Holloway was taken into federal custody at his office in Washington. The owner of the Laredo Fulfillment Center, a man named Garrett Polk, who'd incorporated the company 2 months before Holloway approved the contract amendment, was picked up at his home in El Paso at 6 a.m. 3 additional individuals connected to Kellerton's operations division were detained for questioning by the end of the day. Kellerton's contract with the VA was suspended pending investigation. An emergency audit was ordered for all 6 affected facilities. A Senate Oversight Subcommittee requested briefings by the end of the month. Petra found out about most of this secondhand. She'd gone home on Wednesday night and slept for 11 hours, the first real sleep she'd had in over a week, and she woke up to 17 missed calls and a text from her sister in Tucson that said, I just saw your name in a news alert. Call me. She called her sister. She cried a little, which she hadn't expected. Her sister cried more, which she had. Then she made real coffee, not break room coffee, her own good coffee, and sat at her kitchen table and looked at the space where the folder had been. She'd turned over the originals to Weston's team on day 3. The table looked bare without them. She'd carried that documentation for so long it had started to feel like part of her. Her phone rang again. San Antonio number, not Decker this time, Mrs. Solis. The voice was a woman's, formal, with the careful diction of someone reading from a script that she'd also written. My name is Deputy Administrator Chen. I'm calling from the Office of the Secretary for Veterans Affairs. I'd like to talk with you about your prior employment at Morrow and about a position we'd like to offer you in conjunction with the ongoing systemic review. Petra was quiet for a moment. What kind of position? She said. Pharmaceutical Integrity Specialist, operating across the Southwest region, independent review authority, direct reporting line to the IG's office. We're building the oversight structure that should have existed before any of this happened, and we'd like to build it with people who've demonstrated they can find what needs finding even when the system is working against them. She looked at her kitchen, at the bare table, at the cold morning light coming through the window above the sink. I'll need to review the terms, she said. Of course, and I want it in writing that independent review means independent. No director approval required before I flag a discrepancy, no compliance office in the chain of custody on my reports. A pause. I think we can discuss that. I'm not discussing it, Petra said. I'm describing what the job needs to be in order for it to be worth doing. If that's a problem, this is a short call. Another pause, shorter this time. We'll draft terms consistent with what you've described. Decker was the last person she saw at Fort Sam Houston. She stopped by on a Friday morning to return her visitor's badge and ran into him in the main corridor, coming from wherever Decker came from at 9 in the morning. I heard about the offer, he said. Word travels fast. In this building, yes. He walked with her toward the exit. The corridor was busy, personnel moving through in both directions, the particular organized energy of a place that was always on some level in the middle of something. You're going to take it? I think so. The terms need work. But the job needs doing. It does. He held the door for her. Outside, the March light was doing its flat, sharp thing again, but it bothered her less this morning. For what it's worth, what you did here mattered. Not just the documentation. The way you worked. The fact that you stayed. She looked at him. You would have figured it out eventually, maybe. But those 11 soldiers were on compromised medications for 6 weeks before your documentation gave us what we needed to move. Eventually is its own kind of cost. She thought about that. She thought about the inventory logs she'd started keeping out of instinct. The anomaly she'd noticed on a Tuesday morning 14 months ago that she'd almost dismissed because it was minor and the shift was busy and she had other things to do. She hadn't dismissed it. "Take care of your people, Sergeant Major," she said. He nodded. "You too, Ms. Solis." She walked to her car across the same lot where she'd parked 7 nights ago with a folder full of evidence and no idea what she was walking into. The city opened up in front of her as she pulled out. The highway, the overpass, the pale blue sky above San Antonio that was just starting to carry some actual warmth. She had a folder of her own now to start. New job, new reporting structure. 11 facilities on the audit list, and who knew what she'd find. She already had a feeling she'd find something. She turned north and drove.